So next up, we have, there we go. We have Paul Hadjy and Joseph Gan. I'm going to go ahead and add them here to our spotlight. Joseph and Paul, there you guys are. Welcome. All right. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly introduce this next panel. It's going to be on the topic of going under the hood with cybersecurity founders. So as a quick introduction for Paul, Paul is the founder of Horangi and has over a decade of experience and expertise in anti-money laundering, insider threat, cybersecurity, government, and commercial banking. Paul leads a team of cybersecurity specialists who create software that solve challenging cybersecurity problems, bringing world-class cyber solutions to the Asia market. And for Joseph, Joseph is the founder of Viki. Prior to founding Viki, he spent most of his career in Mindef's Center for Strategic Infocom Technologies, where he headed both cryptography and cybersecurity labs. He holds a master's and bachelor's in electrical engineering from Stanford, which he attended on an overseas merit scholarship. Joseph and Paul, welcome.
Thanks, Theo.
Yeah, thanks, Theo.
It's great to have you guys here, and I'm very excited to dive into this with you today. I consider you both friends and obviously admire what you guys have done to build both of your companies the way you have over the years. I want to just kind of set the tone here for this panel. Both of you have worked, just being familiar with your careers, even before you started these companies, you've both worked at your startups, but you've also worked at really big companies. But there was some allure that brought you into starting Viki and brought you into starting Horangi when you were previously working at larger organizations. So maybe, Paul, we'll start with you. Could you share a little bit about what is it that originally drew you to the startup world, and why did you decide to found Horangi years ago?
Yeah, sure. So I guess like a bit of background about myself is right out of college, I was working for a government contractor in the US who mostly supported the defense industry there. It was a pretty large company, but at the time I had been reading about the startup space. This would have been like 2007, 2008. And I was quite interested. And then one of my friends was interviewing at a company called Palantir. And he didn't get the job, but as part of the sort of process of him not getting it, they asked if he had any recommendations for people that also might be a good fit. And subsequently recommended me, and then I got the role. But I'll never forget like their ads on the metro. It was just like an empty, like the metro is like the MRT in DC, where I'm from, and there was just like an empty waste basket with like a crumpled up piece of paper in there, and it's like help us solve like the hardest problems in defense, right? Yeah, that intrigued me, and it didn't have anything else other than that. And it just said like Palantir logo and visit our website. Which of course I did, and then I was kind of hooked. But and then like reading more about the startup space, being a part of Palantir, spending 7 years there, really got me excited about the possibilities. Because when I joined that Palantir, it was around 70 people, and then I think it's 3,000 or 4,000 at this point. And by the time I left in 2016, it was already 2,000. So got to see quite a bit of a journey there, and I think that excited me. And work with like some of the better venture capitalists in the world, with like Founders Fund and Peter Thiel and those folks. And yeah, like I was sitting in the office. Like my office is the two other people. One of them founded Anduril, which is kind of a big defense company in the US, which is worth over 20 billion now. The other office mate that I had is now one of the principals at Founder Fund. So it was a good opportunity to see like the sort of growth capabilities in that space. Yeah, and then I was hooked at that point. I'd always started companies as a kid, like whether it was like mowing grass or shoveling snow, relative levels of success. But after leaving Palantir and going to Grab, a bit different in terms of a business there, decided that, hey, like I'm noticing these problems that I'm seeing that Grab is facing back in 2016, like being a cloud first company and not having many security solutions. So decided to make the jump and try to solve that problem myself while I was still young enough to take the risk or felt comfortable taking that risk.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that story. Joseph, can you share a little bit about your journey? What drew you to the startup world coming from Mindef?
Yeah, Theo. So as you mentioned, I was actually on an overseas merit scholarship from the Singapore government. And this was in Stanford, essentially during the dot-com boom from 1996 to 2000. For better or for worse, I had to come back to serve my bond with the Singapore government. For better because I missed the dot-com bust, but it was exciting to see all that happening in the late 90s. So as a result, I was always tracking the startup scene, following VC blogs. And while I loved my work from a technology perspective, great culture and all that in CSIT, I think many of you know people there as well. And I really loved the kind of scope that I was doing. But at the same time, I was like, do I want to do this for the next 40 years of my life and not, take this plunge into the startup world that I've always kind of wanted to do a bit of? So when the opportunity came around in 2011, I was like, okay, I think there's a time, it's a great team, great kind of business potential. I had some ideas of how to do it. Obviously, not a lot developed yet. But I felt, okay, this is enough that I could build something, and I felt it was, at least the risk was mitigated, right? All the checkboxes that VCs look for would be there. So that's when we took the plunge. It was definitely fairly early, 2011, doing mobile security when mobile banking wasn't quite, that predominance yet. We had to go knocking on a lot of doors and so on. But once mobile banking overtook internet banking in 2014, that's when things really started taking for us, both in Singapore and around the region.
Excellent. Now, I want to slowly, not too slowly, because we only have 30 minutes, but I want to slowly just kind of go through your careers here as startup founders. And, you shared a little bit about what thrusted you into entrepreneurship. Let's fast forward slightly from there to the point when you're starting your team, building your team, your initial hires. Paul, can you share a little bit about how you thought about hiring the initial folks on your team as an early entrepreneur? Were you looking for specialists? Were you looking for generalists? Did you know exactly who you wanted to hire when you planned on starting a company? Were you set on hiring these 4 people that you had worked with before? Just share a little bit with some aspiring founders that we might have on this call, or early stage founders on this call, about how you went about hiring in the early days.
Sure. I'll tell you a bit about how I did it, and then potentially may not be the right way, honestly, because it was my first time around, so I have some insights there. But I think for me, we, myself and the Horangi's co-founder Lee, we're first cousins actually, so we've known each other our whole lives, and we're kind of going into this business, beginning on the consulting side of things. And he has I have some experience in IR. He has a lot more experience in incident response. And that was kind of how we started the business, is by doing incident response for companies and doing training around incident response in terms of helping companies recover from attacks. But then as we looked at building our first product, which wasn't the one that was eventually successful, we were looking for someone that, one, was kind of willing to join part-time, at least initially, which because we hadn't gotten funding, which I think is, there's a reality there. If you have a lot of funding, then it might be easier to find people that have more experience in this space. But in our case, we had people that were interested and willing to solve these problems with us on a part-time basis at first. And that was our first hire was Nico, who's still at Horangi today, who now runs. He's basically the CISO for Horangi. But we really focused on personality and generalists, because we didn't know what we wanted to build fully. We were still experimenting. And a lot of things we were doing were enabling us as a service provider to help the companies with the problems that we were helping them solve. And then also, after that, we hired another guy in Korea at the time who had some experience in incident response as well, and in the space, and also had just graduated from school, so had a bit more freedom in terms of the choices that he can make. So I think there's again, if you start with funding and you can go out there and look for people that fit and you know exactly what you want to build, I think there's a right way to do that in terms of experience, in terms of interest level, and in terms of commitment. But in our case, we were a little bit just winging it, and doing this on the side while we had full-time jobs. And in that aspect, we were also hiring people that also were willing and capable of doing that initially. Eventually, we saw traction, and then both of those people joined full-time, and then we kind of grew the business based upon the thing that we were focused on building. But I highly recommend, if you have an existing job and don't have the financial capacity to just quit your job and start a business, do it part-time first. experiment, understand the risk, and then, you know, take the leap once you're a bit more comfortable and the team is more comfortable, and maybe you've got funding, maybe you don't, maybe you're profitable, which may be the better way to run the business in the long term. But yeah, I think that's kind of some insights in terms of how I did it. We also got lucky at it. I think you know, that's part of any entrepreneur's journey, is there's just sometimes when you get lucky. There's a lot of times when you're not. But in our case, I think we did get a bit lucky in the beginning in terms of getting that traction initially on the services side.
Joseph, how did you go about your early hiring when you were just launching Viki?
Yeah, we actually went through, you know, a few stages of growth in our company. I think for those who don't know, we kind of built a mobile security solution based around like a secure virtual machine. And if it sounds very complicated, it's because it was and it still is. And it took us quite a number of years to build that. And what happened in the early years was we ended up hiring actually a number of security researchers. And what I did was I was the first hire. I was a CTO initially. So of course I was chugging away at the code. But from a security research perspective, I reached out to some of my ex-colleagues who had left MinDev as well. And I said, hey, you know, we need some help building this stuff. Could you do some work for us? And many of them, I mean, a bit like Paul, right? Willing to do this on a part-time basis, helping me out, chugging away at a few pieces of code here and there, doing some key research around the protections, initially on iOS, of course, but later on Android as well. And one of the things that I didn't do so well is, you know, I came from CSIT, and as Theo said, I headed up research labs, right? And that really meant I was more of a researcher, an architect kind of guy, and I wasn't really an engineering kind of guy. So to be absolutely frank, I think I really struggled the first few years trying to get the engineering stuff in order. And, you know, if I just stuck to doing services and research, we're fine. But once we actually needed to start building products and putting them in the hands of clients, even at relatively small scales, I was like, wow, how do we do this? And it was a big mess the first few years, right? You know, working late nights, weekends, you know, not much structure in place. So we were quite fortunate. I think about 7-8 years ago, we started building up a much stronger engineering team. We eventually hired a guy who would replace me as CTO, and then that's why I'm the CEO today. And of course, since then, we built up a much stronger team. But in the early years, we didn't really, I would say, focus a lot on hiring very good engineers. We tried, but as I think Paul mentioned, funding is limited. Talent pool was, you know, obviously somewhat restrictive as well. And, you know, there's so many people you can just convince to join a 2 or 3 year old startup, right? Without much funding, without much capability and products at a time. But over time, we managed to strengthen that. And that's something that I think if I had to go back and try to do that again, I would probably try to spend a bit more time, you know, really looking for good people who would, you know, be able to stay with us for the long term. Because, I mean, we've been around 12 years now. Very few people have stayed us for the majority of that journey. And part of it, of course, has changed, or part of it, I think in the early years, we didn't quite know what we needed in the company as well.
So 12 years, Joseph, coming back to you here, lots that you've probably faced. I think for founders that have maybe been operating their companies just for a few years, you had a big boom and then you kind of had a dive, just looking at the markets and what's happened just in the software world over the last couple of years, whether you're a founder in security or outside of security. But your scale of how you're looking at markets has been much longer than that. I think a lot longer than what a lot of founders face. 12 years, it's quite remarkable. Can you maybe just talk a little bit, Joseph, about that journey of being in the market for that long and kind of the roller coaster, the wave of what you see? There's so much, I always, you know, think about this. There's so much that you face as a founder that's in your control, and that's what you really try to focus on. But there is so much that you face outside of your control that you really, you can't control it one bit. And your job, though, as the CEO and as the founder, is still to be able to navigate it, not just for yourself, but for your shareholders, for your employees, for everyone involved in the business. So can you just share a little bit around the ups and downs of what you see in the market and how you've navigated that?
Yeah, so there are pros and cons, of course, to our journey. On the pro side, because we had been around for 7-8 years actually 8-9 years by the time COVID hit, we actually had turned profitable already. and almost all our revenue was recurring license revenue rather than services revenue. After we had kind of hit traction around the 5-6 year mark, we had actually reduced our services business in order to focus on recurring license revenue. What that meant was that when COVID hit and things started standing still, we kind of already had not just the revenue but also sales teams in place, overseas expansions. So it allowed us to tide through COVID. And we did have the flexibility to kind of sail through that. Don't get me wrong, it still wasn't easy. I don't think it was easy for any of us. But at least I think we were in a much stronger position than a much younger startup that started probably just before COVID. On the flip side, of course, we started in 2011, and as I mentioned, mobile banking only overtook the internet banking in 2014. And what that meant is for those first few years, mobile security was not exactly at the top of our clients or prospective clients' minds. These days you hear everybody talking about mobile malware scams and screen sharing, and everybody's coming to us. It's like, oh, what can you do? What have you done? And so on. But as you can imagine, 12 years ago, people were like, yeah, I know there's an attack, but yeah, maybe it's not so high a priority right now. So this first few years from a customer and revenue perspective were definitely a lot more challenging, and trying to then build a product on a relatively shoestring budget was definitely quite challenging and quite tough as an entrepreneur. Fortunately, because of the nature of our technology, we were able to attract funding from VCs fairly early on in our first year, in our third year, and that really allowed us to ramp it up. But yeah, those first few years, I think just trying to do everything and trying to get that product market fit, those were tough years, I would say. And I don't think it ever gets easy. I think, as Paul said, your first product wasn't quite the one that you saw traction. And I think we saw the same thing as well. We kind of like, okay, I think this is the one it's going to be. And we're like, it's taking a while. How do we pivot and so on? So I think that's going to be normal. I think every founder is going to struggle with that.
Paul, could you also speak to that a little bit around just navigating the markets, things inside and outside of your control as a founder, and how you went about that on a daily basis, but also maybe more on a strategic basis as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, like I think lots of mistakes made on our end through that process. I mean, on our journey, we started originally with a web. This would have been in 2016. We started with a web application scanner. Well, actually, even before that, we started building essentially an EDR at that point. So we started out with Fast Hour, which we were using for a forensic collection on the endpoint, which we were going to build and sell to other incident response firms. In looking at the market, realizing that's not a big enough business for us to do, we built out a web application scanner, which is similar to what these guys Detectify are doing, which is a Swedish company. So start building that out in terms of being able to scan people's web applications remotely and then providing those results in UI. Then switch to a code scanner because we thought that was going to be more important and subsequently a bigger opportunity for us. But where we really saw traction was in some of the services business we were doing. We saw a lot of people that couldn't really easily comply with compliance standards and security requirements in using the public cloud. And built a prototype, originally just as part of a services engagement to check these things against compliance standards, which was the early stages of our SaaS or now SaaS product, Warden, which is a CSPM, CIM, and threat detection, basically an all-around cloud security platform. But yeah, it was a lot of experimenting, working with customers on our initial products, seeing what stuck. And then, while tinkering on the services side, really built something that, was in demand and people were willing to pay a decent amount for. And ultimately, that's kind of how we got there. I think there's better ways to do it. I think in the next company, if I start another company, I'll definitely do a lot more sort of research and surveys for the prospective buyers that I think I want to target, and understanding hey, do they want to pay? How much are they willing to pay? Are you willing to write on paper that you're going to commit to paying, assuming I can solve this problem? Those types of things that I think are really important before building a product, and something that I'll probably do if I ever start a company again. But in our stage, we were just kind of tinkering, building things, seeing if it stuck, while doing the services business to sort of support the growth. And ultimately that services business helped us identify a product that we did build. But that is expensive way to do it if you're not doing it in a profitable manner. And at that time we weren't. Yeah, I think there's multiple choices there. You can be have a services arm that's profitable and can pay for the R&D. I think that's a decent way to do it. It probably will take longer. Or you can kind of gather the data prior, talk to the potential buyers of whatever product or solution you're trying to sell, and kind of get commitment and see if you can get 10 paying customers basically to verbally commit that if you build a product that solves this problem, they will pay for it verbally and written. I think written is an important part because a lot of people will say that they want to buy something, but then when you ask them to write it down, it's the next step. Obviously, they're not writing a check yet, which is a whole other thing. But just having them write down like a letter that says "I'm willing to pay for this" is a step that a lot of people will stop at, surprisingly. Even though it doesn't take much time, but it does take commitment, and that's also something that you can use to raise money. As well, right? If you have that commitment from people who've written it down and are willing to talk to venture capitalists, whomever you're raising money from, I think that's the right way to raise money. Not what I did, but if I had to do it again, that's what I would do.
Well, you weren't. I don't believe you attended last week where we hosted the front lines in the U.S. We host this for Asia and the U.S. And in this exact same panel, speaking with a couple of founders in the United States, that exact same point was mentioned, where it was basically advice to founders to make sure there's a big distinction between someone really liking something and someone actually committing to paying for it. So just wanted to call that out. It came up on both panels. Now, Joseph, coming back to you, you talked a little bit about raising a couple rounds of funding, and Paul, I know you did as well. So we'll direct this question to you afterwards too. But could you share a little bit around your fundraising process, Joseph? Any best practices that you're willing to share with aspiring or current founders that are on the call? Anything that went particularly well in your process? Anything that you wish that you could have done over, or perhaps a teachable moment of something that didn't quite go as well as you had hoped?
Yeah, so I think maybe a few key points. One is that I think every startup entrepreneur knows this, but maybe for those who haven't seen it, be prepared to knock on a lot of doors, right? There are going to be a lot of VCs who either don't understand or don't believe in your direction. But there's also going to be a lot of VCs who will look at you and it's like, yeah, you got maybe half of it right, but this other half, I can give you this inputs. And I think listen to those inputs. Not every, VCs aren't magical. They don't know the future. But when you hear enough inputs from multiple VCs, it helps to kind of help you sharpen your pitch as well. So don't expect that the first VC you go to is going to be the one. But I think, be prepared to do that over time. So we did actually talk to VCs actually within 3 months of starting the company, actually. And I still remember because I actually walked into the Intellectual Property Office of Singapore and filed the patent the day before the first VC meeting. Just because we were worried, if I pass this to a VC in a deck, they circulate it, it's kind of published, I can't file a patent for it. So we filed the patent before meeting even our first VC. The patent writing class I took in Stanford helped, but I also called a friend in church just to give me some free legal advice. But that first VC wasn't the one that we closed a deal with eventually. That took maybe another 8-9 months before we did close with a final VC. We did get some initial preliminary kind of offers that they didn't close in the end, which I'm glad they didn't, because actually the amounts they were offering and the valuation they're offering actually ended up being far lower than the round we eventually did close for our Series A. And you must remember, this was 2011, 2012, where Series A funding in Singapore was almost non-existent. We ended up closing it around overseas. But of course, today, I think for many cybersecurity startup founders, you would likely be able to close that round in Singapore. Series A, Series B, I think are both fairly straightforward. But in that time, 2012, 2014, we ended up going overseas for those. But, I must have knocked on maybe 20, 30, 40 doors. And some were keen, but they couldn't invest because of portfolio conflicts. Some, I went to VCs in the US and like, but you've got no US business, come back later when you have some US clients and so on. So I think just, you have to be prepared to see the rejections. Don't give up. Continue talking to clients, get those letters of commitments. Even if it's just some indication of interest, those do really help. We did get some funding in terms of services R&D. We got expressions of interest, strategic partnerships. We did close 1 or 2 deals. And I think finally for our Series A investors, they're like, okay, that sounds pretty interesting. You've gotten quite a good bit of traction, but it took us a number of years, a number of months before we could get there.
Paul, could you share a little bit about your fundraising journey?
Yeah. I mean, it was similar to Joseph's, like a lot of no's before we got the first yes. And yeah, we basically had one I put in my own money at the time, which was helped me sweat and focus on it. And then we also, on the back of that raise, like the equivalent amount that I put in from an investor in the US, which is more quite close to them, which is a small venture capital fund. Did that on a safe note, and then like after we got some traction, we had like 700K in revenue. We went around to the VCs. We got some interest from a lot of Singapore VCs. Got quite far with many, and then had basically one option that didn't work out, and then another 3 months later we had another option, and we were able to get a second option while we had those 2 options, the second 2 options 6 months later, and eventually chose one, which was Monk Hill Ventures, who led our Series A. But that was a really stressful time. I remember like when the first one fell through, like just sitting in my bed for like 2 days, just like reeling. And it was like the first time for me too, right? So like these days, like I get less stressed out because I'm just kind of like used to getting beaten up all the time, but like then it was a bit more rough. And then but powered on and was able to get the sort of second set of term sheets about 6 months later, after the business matured, landed some big clients in that period too, so it raised our valuation, similar to what Joseph said. It also put a bit of a chip on my shoulder as well to keep pushing through and kind of prove them that they were wrong about us. So I think like all in all, I think sometimes like throughout the journey, some of the things that you really want to work out and don't might actually be blessings in disguise. So don't get too discouraged. Don't let it bother you. And just like look at the percentages sometimes, because like I have done many ventures of varying sizes. Most of them have failed. So I think it's important to understand that it doesn't always work out, and that's okay. Like what matters is you learned a lot, and you can kind of move on from that and do better the next time. That goes with specific instances of like deals or not getting term sheets or getting term sheets, and then making wrong choices about what's in those term sheets, which I'm sure I've definitely done. I'm sure Joseph's probably done that too. But all those things I think are lessons for the next time around, which is hopefully if you're not too scarred by it, you'll be doing that.
So once you both raise funding, obviously the expectations rise with that, and a lot of the pressure and a lot of the focus turns to your go-to market. And now you are on the path to raising your next round. So can you share a little bit, and we'll come back to you, Joseph, here. Can you share a little bit around how did your go-to market shift? Obviously, now you had a little bit more money. I'm sure your team expanded and you can focus a little bit more on growth. But how did you think about your go-to market at the time? And maybe more, just a little bit more relevant, how are you thinking about go-to market in today's world, where markets are, it's much more challenging to sell now than it was just several years ago for just about every business. A lot of organizations are thinking about consolidation, right? As budgets get cut, as the market contracts and budgets get cut, buyers start to think about consolidating and finding ways to work with one account team, one customer support team, one onboard and procure one solution instead of, maybe whatever the market deems as best in breed for each individual point product. How do you navigate that as a founder and advise your teams in a much more challenging environment of 2023? You want to take that one first, Joseph?
Sure. So, yeah, it's an interesting question, actually. And I think maybe part of the context is that we do see that for a lot of US startups, there's a tendency to do one very single focus point product. And I think that's where you're coming from as well, where, we just do one thing, right? And that's not, I think, what either Paul or myself have done. You can kind of hear we both have a bit of a set of products, right? On our part, we do provide multiple solutions around mobile security, from protecting the application to second-factor authentication to kind of trusted privacy biometrics. And what that ends up doing is, in a way, clients come to us because we actually help them roll out 2 to 3 solutions, not necessarily all at once. They might say, oh, I just need help right now to protect my mobile application, to guard against all these malware scams and meet the Bank of Thailand regulatory requirements. So I need you right now, but oh, I like that you can do this and that down the road as well as my digital transformation matures. So I think that's what you're alluding to as well, where clients actually do want to come to a single vendor to be able to solve a set of problems for them. They don't really want to go to 20 vendors solving 20 different problems, in their own unique ways. And of course, when you talk about consolidation, there's a tendency to try to unify all of that. And I would say from a mobile security perspective, that's kind of what we're trying to do from our product suite. That said, I think increasingly, of course, we do think that there will be more consolidation down the road. I think there will still be fragmentation. It's hard to avoid that. Cybersecurity is a very, very broad, very complex area. But in areas where we can create synergies and consolidated kind of solutions, I think clients will tend to gravitate towards those.
So we're coming up here on time, guys. So what I want to do to end this is a lightning round. So Paul, we're going to come to you first. And what I'd like for you to share is your best piece of advice for an aspiring founder that we have here on this call. What is it that you would share for someone who's looking to start their first business, perhaps in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think, well, I have like multiple pieces there. It's quite difficult to choose just one, but yeah, I think if you're going to venture capital back around, I think like one thing to understand is that like you as the founder actually have a lot more power than you think. I think there's a common perception, especially in Asia. I think it's a bit different now in the US, but that the founder like needs to do whatever the VCs say. And I think, ultimately you as the founder have a lot of sort of power, and it's important to kind of like protect that as you go throughout the different funding rounds. Because a lot of bad things can happen like through your course of the business that can change the sort of business in many different ways, and you having the capability to make decisions, as well as like saying you're going to quit, right? Like I think actually has like a lot more power than people recognize. Because and can be important, right? Like as you go through the different trials and tribulations of running a business, especially with a VC board, I really think it's important for people to understand that founders have a bit more power than you think. You don't have all the power, but a bit more than you think. I think that's an important insight from me. And happy if anyone has questions about that, feel free to reach out to me and I can dig in more there.
Joseph, how would you describe your best piece of advice for an aspiring founder?
Okay, as Paul said, there's a lot of things you can do, but maybe if I were just to leave you with one thing, entrepreneurship, unfortunately, can be quite tough. As you've heard from Paul and myself, you will meet multiple rejections along the way. But so I think just don't give up, right? Not to say that you just keep doing the same thing over and over again when it isn't working, right? But don't give up. Think about how you can do things better, how you can solve your clients' problems. I think if you just are just persistent at it, you'll find ways to make it work.
Awesome. Joseph and Paul, I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you guys very much for sharing your insights and just being so open and transparent as well. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed that. That was a great panel.